The next thing that I had to do was convert all of this into something called phthalic anhydride. To do that, I just dumped it all into a big beaker, and I turned on the hot plate. As it warmed up, it started giving off water vapor because the crystals were still a bit wet. I then stirred it until it looked like all the steam was gone, and I quickly put a flask on top of it. At first, it looked like it was just fogging up again. However, it was also forming some fluffy white crystals. This was all phthalic
my water
anhydride,
right here.
and this was basically the entire reaction. The high temperature.
One time, all the
was splitting
joints
apart
in
the
my
phthalic
left hand
acid
just
and
decided
turning it
they
into
didn't
the
want to work
phthalic
anymore.
anhydride and water.
Yeah.
I'm not playing on the
Normally,
right
phthalic
graphics.
anhydride is a solid, but because of the high
The
temperature,
first time I met you,
it
you're
was
like
getting vaporized
talking
as
about
it
how you
formed.
like your
This
left
vapor
hand.
then rose to the top and
Yeah,
started
I was
depositing
annoyed.
itself on
Just
the
started
flask
happening
and the colder part of the beaker.
badly.
What I
Alright,
had to do
so
now was wait until a
1,
decent amount had
2,
formed and then
3,
harvest it.
4.
However,
1,
I had to let it cool
2,
down first,
3.
because if I took the flask off while it was still hot,
Again.
it would shoot out a bunch
Alright,
of the
now
phthalic anhydride.
I don't see anybody whiteboarding
After
down
sitting there
because
for
they
a
don't know
couple
how
minutes,
to.
though,
But
it
I need to
usually
know.
wasn't angry anymore, and I could open it up
Okay, so I
and
need
see
to
out all
do
the crystals. It initially looked
1,
like there was quite a
2,
bit,
3,
but it was all just super
4,
fluffy. I
5,
moved it around until it
6,
kind of looked like a
7,
cotton ball,
8.
and then I was able to lift it out.
Please.
I then put it back
Okay,
on the
wait.
heat, and I again
Camera?
waited for more crystals to form.
Wait.
Now what I had to do was keep repeating this cycle until all of the phthalic acid had been converted. At first, I was having a lot of fun harvesting these puffballs, and I naively thought that it wouldn't take very long.
No, dude. I went down a
However,
tad
I
bit and
slowly
then I just
realized
went
how
flying.
wrong I was when I was still
Yeah,
doing
wait.
the same thing over an hour and a half later. It turned out that because it was so fluffy, it just looked like I was making a lot. In reality, each run barely gave me anything, and it started feeling like it was a never-ending process. Eventually, though, about 3.5
No,
hours later, it stopped making any crystals,
Who left?
and the pain was
Alex.
finally over.
The goat.
In
He
total,
left.
I ended up getting 11.5 grams of really
What's his
pure
rank? I feel like
and
I've gotten.
fluffy phthalic anhydride.
Oh wait.
So far, everything was
Approach,
going really
jeez.
well, but I was starting to get a bit
Use slash rank
11.5
on
grams
Alex.
was a decent amount of phthalic anhydride, but
I
the
wanna know
rest of
how
the
close I am to
process
passing him.
was really inefficient. I would lose a lot of product with every step, and I
Dude,
might not
he
have
was
done
like
anything
10
by the
levels ahead of me.
time that I
Now
got
he's
to
only
the
5
grade
away.
plate. So last minute, I decided to process the other 80 gloves that were still in the box.
Okay.
Ideally, I would have done this in one shot on a much larger scale, but unfortunately, I didn't have the equipment for it. So, I just did 4 runs of the same thing.
Alright, wait. I gotta
all at the
find
same time.
what the white bar is
The
for
first
this.
extraction part wasn't too
1,
bad, and it
2,
felt like I was
3,
running a little factory.
4,
The phthalic
1,
anhydride part, though,
2,
was
3,
really painful,
4.
and it took another 3.5 hours.
What?
It was actually even
Oh,
worse
flame.
than before,
Right.
because this time, I had to keep cycling between 4 of them, and I wasn't even able to take a break. When it was eventually
went up.
done,
Why am I
I
going
had
up
a
right
bunch
here?
more phthalic anhydride. What I did find odd, though, was that the batches weren't very consistent. I had 2 that were closer to 11, one that was around 12, and one that was above 13.
Dude, that's
I have no
literally the
idea
white
why
bar
this
I need,
happened,
but I don't
but
think I can
either
go
way,
down right here.
I now had 58.4 grams in total. This was way better than just 11.5, and this made me feel a lot more confident. Now the next thing to do was turn all of this phthalic anhydride into something called phthalimide.
That's it. Wait.
To make this
Okay.
happen,
Why
the
doesn't it
first
work
step
right
was
here?
to compress the
Stop
puffballs,
it.
because
Holy
right
crap.
now, they were mostly air.
You want a good pace?
I
Yes.
did this by just stabbing them
Alright.
and mixing them around, and I did it
So
for every
I just
bottle. When I was done, it was still mostly air, but it was significantly better than it was before. I then shoved everything that I had into a large flask, and it almost filled the entire thing. Now with all the phthalic anhydride loaded, I dumped in the only other ingredient that I needed, which was 12 grams of urea. In the past, I purified urea from my own pee, and I do still have some of it, but it unfortunately wasn't enough for this. So instead, I got this urea from an instant cold pack. But anyway, with everything in the flask, I shook it around to mix it as best as I could. When I felt that I had done a decent job, I put it back on the stand, and the next thing to do was heat it up. Normally, I would have used a heating mantle like I did before, but I had to accurately monitor the temperature. The easiest way to do this was by using a hot oil bath, and I set one up using vegetable oil.
Come on.
Me up.
When it all looked
See
good
what
to
you
go,
get.
I turned on the hot plate, and I waited for
Definitely
it to warm up.
record.
As it got hotter, the volume of the stuff in the flask slowly decreased, and there was some vapor coming off. Besides that, though, it didn't look like much was happening, and this was because there probably wasn't. Right now, the urea and the phthalic anhydride were still in the solid phase, and they had a hard time reacting. When it got to around
La.
130 C,
I thought
though,
so.
they started melting and mixing together. As a liquid, they were reacting much more efficiently, and they were combining to make phthalimide and CO2 gas. When I had done this reaction before,
I'm
it had
go
completely
in.
liquefied, but that didn't really happen this time. I mean, it kind of melted, and I did see some bubbling liquid. However, this didn't last for very long, and I think it was because the phthalic anhydride was way
Fuck.
too puffy. This started getting me really worried that this reaction was a complete failure. So what I decided to do was just try and force the reaction
Ooh.
by slowly heating it up to 170 C. I was hoping that it would melt again or
This is
something,
it.
but it didn't
Yeah.
look like too much happened. As a last attempt to fix it, I decided to try mixing it around.
Alright, fast load.
I thought that maybe the puffiness
One.
of the anhydride
Ooh.
Nice.
had prevented it from properly mixing with the urea. Even though it hadn't really melted, it had compressed a lot, and it was quite hard. This made me think that it would be really hard to break apart, but it was surprisingly easy.
6:45, you have to beat it.
I beat it right here.
I then heated it for another 30 minutes at 170 C, and again, it looked like nothing happened.
Oh my.
It was producing
Go,
some ammonia
go,
gas,
go.
though, so it seemed to be doing
Yes,
something.
alright.
Oh my
Let's
god.
continue
I had
doing.
no
Jeez.
idea
Let's
if it
continue
actually
going.
worked, but
Yeah.
I had faith that it did. I figured I would just move on to the next purification step, and I would find out pretty quickly if it had failed. I dumped everything that I had into a beaker, and on top of it, I added 500 mils of hot water. What I had to do next was bring this all to a boil, and to keep it boiling for at
Buddy.
least several minutes. For some reason, though, the hot plate that I was using just didn't get hot enough, and I had to swap it out for a different one. I then cranked up the heat, and it only took a couple minutes to start boiling. The goal here was to get rid of any unreacted urea or phthalic anhydride. In the boiling water, any urea would
the hell?
easily dissolve, and the phthalic anhydride
You're
would
out.
get turned back
What
into
is this?
phthalic acid and then
It's
dissolve.
an interesting
The
one.
chemical that I was hoping I made, though,
639 on
phthalimide, was
that.
nearly insoluble,
Beat
and it
13,
would just
20.
stay as a solid.
For
So what I was waiting for
classic.
here was to see how much of this stuff would disappear. I was honestly really
Easily
scared that it
beatable.
would all just dissolve, but it didn't. Even after boiling it for a while, there was a lot of solid stuff, and this was a really good sign. I didn't know how much phthalimide there was, but I had definitely made some. While it was still hot, I poured it all into a vacuum filter, and I pulled off the
Let's
water.
go.
I washed the powder a few times with boiling water, and then I dumped it all into a bowl.
Ugh.
At this point, it was still kind of wet, so I threw it into an oven for a few hours. When it was done, I had 46.7
Alright, let's see what code I
grams
get.
of nice and dry phthalimide, which was way more than I had expected. I mean, it still wasn't as good as it could have been,
One
but it was
green.
more than good enough. Now the next step was
One
to make
yellow, one green,
anthranilic
one
acid,
yellow.
and this was the part that I really wasn't sure about.
One green, one
Making it from
yellow.
phthalimide
One
is
green, one yellow,
notoriously
one red.
annoying,
One green,
and it
yellow,
has a
one red.
tendency to completely fail. Everything
one,
had to be
yellow
done
one, red
very
one, blue.
carefully, and even slight
One
mistakes
green one.
could turn it into a huge mess. However, I had done it years ago, and I'd found what I thought was a decent way to do it. I figured if I just repeated
Yellow.
exactly what I did, it should turn out fine. The first thing that I needed was to get some
4304.
concentrated bleach, which usually has a concentration between 8 and 10 when it's fresh. Bleach slowly degrades over time though, and I had to know its exact concentration. To do this, I put together this little setup. In the main flask, I loaded it with a very specific amount of bleach, and in the addition funnel above it, I added some 3%
Yep.
peroxide. When I opened the stopper and I let them mix together, they reacted
What the
with
hell?
oxygen gas. I added enough peroxide to destroy all the bleach, and all of this oxygen was bubbled into an inverted grad cylinder. This let me measure how much oxygen was being made, and from this, I was able to do some calculations and find out the concentration of the bleach. I did it 5 times to get a good little set of data, and it averaged out at around 11%. Now that I knew this, I could get started, and I added water to a flask along with some sodium hydroxide drain cleaner. I let it stir until it all dissolved, and then I put
Oh,
together an
no.
ice bath. I also added a thermometer, and I waited for it to cool to around 0°C. When it eventually got there, I started
85,
adding
85.
bleach, and the amount that I
Ah.
used was based on that 11% concentration
Buddy.
84,
that I
85.
had just calculated. As I did this, the temperature
It's
would
not
increase
a-
a bit, and it was
it
important
is.
to keep it
3231.
below 5°C. To help with
4222.
this, I pre-cooled the bleach in the fridge, and I also only added it in small portions.
Fuck.
When I was done,
23,
I took the
23,
flask of the ice bath,
22,
and I
24,
dropped in the
or
funnel.
44.
Now what I had to
22,
do was add all
44.
the phthalimide, and I started dumping it in.
Alright, watch.
As
This
it
will be the
mixed
first
with
code I look in the
bleach,
book.
It didn't look like much was happening, and this was mostly because it
Alright.
wasn't very soluble. After everything
I think
was
it's a
added,
failed run.
I washed the funnel with some water.